All right, so, we've been looking at all this fascinating stuff about scripting and autism.
All right.
And this time you've brought some really compelling material, a piece by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks,
Yeah,
and this 2025 research paper by Strohmeyer and their colleagues.
that's right.
So we're going to kind of take a deep dive into all this.
For sure. And, one of the key things that I think is so crucial for us to understand
Mm,
from what you've shared is that Dr. Horrocks makes this really powerful argument that scripting,
right.
which, a lot of folks think of as something that needs to be corrected
Oh,
or
yeah.
faded away,
Yeah.
they're saying, no, this is actually like a really vital form of communication
Interesting.
for a lot of autistic people,
Okay.
and especially for those who are what are called Gestalt language processors.
Yeah, and you know what's so fascinating is when I was going through these sources,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the first things that jumped out at me was Dr. Horrocks pointed out this really surprising difference in research.
Oh, really?
So if you go on Google Scholar,
And you type in script fading and autism, you get like a huge number of results.
Wow.
Like over 1,500.
Okay.
But then the moment you add Gestalt language processing to that search,
Interesting.
it drops to just a handful.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It's a huge difference. And it's not just like a research thing. It really shows like a fundamental blind spot
Right.
in the field to like how a significant portion of autistic people actually communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that discrepancy is really what we're going to be talking about today.
Exactly.
Because, you know, script fading, as it's understood, especially in like the world of ABA, applied behavior analysis,
Right.
it involves teaching these kind of preset phrases.
Oh, okay.
And often they're phrases that are kind of created by adults
Yeah.
to use in social situations.
Right.
And the aim is to then reduce those supports over time.
Right.
So you kind of fade out the prompts and get to this thing called independent speech.
Okay. So let's dig into that a little bit.
Yeah. So what does the behavioral literature actually say about script fading?
So, some of this foundational work by Krantz and McClanahan,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's more recent studies from like 2016 by Akers and colleagues, and then 2022, Topaz and Ulki Koglu.
Wow.
They all basically paint this picture of a pretty structured type of intervention.
Okay.
So, you teach these really specific phrases
Okay.
for things like greetings or initiating conversations,
Right.
and then you very systematically lessen the assistance.
Yeah.
So that could be verbal cues
Yeah.
or visual prompts,
Okay.
whatever you need to reach that kind of spontaneous speech or independent speech.
Right.
And, as Dr. Hoerricks really points out, it's all about how those terms are defined.
Right. Because like, what does independent even mean in this context?
Exactly.
So what are the kind of core assumptions driving this approach to language?
Yeah, so I think at the heart of it, it's really based on this Skinnerian understanding of language.
Okay.
So this is a perspective that views speech as essentially a behavior that is learned and shaped through reinforcement.
Right.
And so valid communication, from this viewpoint, it's very linear, it's decontextualized,
Mm-hmm.
it needs to be measurable.
Okay.
So can the child say the right words at the right time without any help?
Yeah.
It's very much focused on what you can see and measure
Right.
and less about the child's inner world or, what they're actually trying to say.
Okay, I see. So how does Gestalt language processing fit into all of this?
Right. So that's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because Gestalt language processing is a completely different way of developing language.
Okay.
So unlike, the typical way of thinking about it, which is called analytic language processing,
Mm-hmm.
where you kind of learn language word by word,
Right.
GLPs learn language in these whole chunks,
Interesting.
which are called gestalts.
Okay.
And so these could be like, a line from a movie
Mhm.
or a phrase that a caregiver says a lot.
Right.
Anything that's experienced is like one meaningful unit. And the important thing is that these gestalts aren't always coming from the outside.
Yeah.
They can be generated by the individual themselves.
Okay.
And they can hold like a really deep personal meaning.
Interesting.
And this whole perspective is like almost entirely absent from research on script fading.
So when we talk about fading these scripts for someone who's a Gestalt language processor,
Right.
it's not the same as like fading a prompt for someone who, processes language analytically.
Exactly.
It's a totally different thing.
It is a totally different thing. And Dr. Hoerricks actually argues that the word fading is really problematic
Hmm.
because it implies that you're taking away something beneficial,
Okay.
like something that the child needs.
Yeah.
And for a GLP, these scripts are often the very building blocks of their communication.
Wow.
So, trying to fade them isn't helping them be more independent.
Right.
it's actually potentially dismantling a tool that they're using to connect with the world.
So it's not a neutral act for them.
No, it can be very disruptive and even harmful.
So the issue isn't just about like where these scripts are coming from.
Right.
Like, are they coming from an adult or are they coming from the child?
Yeah.
It's about a deeper misunderstanding of how autistic people, and especially GLPs, communicate right from the start.
Absolutely. And I think, Dr. Hoerricks really highlights this point.
Yeah.
That the dominant way of understanding communication is rooted in this idea that analytic language processing is the normal way to do it.
Yeah.
It's the standard.
Right.
And everything else is kind of measured against that.
Right.
And this is something that they really dig into in their books, like holistic language instruction and decolonizing language education.
Wow.
And even No Place for Autism.
Okay.
And they actually make these connections to other areas, too.
Oh, interesting.
Like in the science of reading movement, there's this huge focus on phonics, which, can sometimes overlook all the other ways that people engage with language and literacy.
Right. So for a Gestalt language processor, scripting isn't bad. It's actually how their language begins to develop.
Exactly. And Dr. Hoerricks is really clear on this point.
Okay.
Scripting is how they begin to communicate verbally.
Yeah.
These gestalts that they're using aren't just random.
Yeah.
They're full of meaning.
Right.
They're connected to emotions and social stuff.
Okay.
And so to dismiss them or try to get rid of them, it's basically saying this whole way of communicating isn't valid.
Which brings up this idea of epistemic injustice.
Right.
Can you explain what that is and how it applies here?
Yeah, so epistemic injustice is basically when a system doesn't recognize certain ways of knowing or making meaning as valid.
Right.
So in this case, GLPs, they create meaning through language in a way that doesn't fit with like the neurotypical norms. So their language development doesn't follow that expected path.
Yeah.
Like from single words to sentences.
Right.
So it's often not even seen as real communication.
Oh, wow.
It's just dismissed.
Yeah.
Not because it's not valuable to the individual,
Right.
but because the dominant framework just doesn't get it.
It's invisible to them.
Exactly.
So script fading with its focus on shaping behavior and achieving this spontaneity, it really misunderstands how GLPs develop language naturally.
Yeah, the behaviorist perspective is, all about shaping and reinforcing. Words are like these operants, and communication is about doing what you're told.
Okay.
But for GLPs, language starts with these whole gestalts.
Right.
These units of sound and meaning that are tied to emotions and relationships.
Yeah.
And over time, and with support, these gestalts are then like broken down and recombined into new language.
Okay.
And this process needs understanding. A feeling of safety and time. Not this forced fading.
Right.
Based on a model that doesn't even fit.
Yeah. And even that word spontaneity.
Right.
It seems like it means something different depending on your perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in ABA, spontaneous often means that you can use a taught script without being prompted. But for a GLP, real spontaneity comes from that internalization process.
Okay.
Like you repeat and layer, meaning until a gestalt becomes part of you. And then you can use pieces of it or adapt it in new situations.
Right.
But when you're ready.
Yeah.
So fading scripts too early can actually disrupt that whole process.
Wow.
And it can even, Dr. Hoerricks talks about this, it can even lead to shutdown.
Right. And Dr. Hoerricks also shares their personal experience as someone who went through these kinds of interventions.
Right.
And it sounds like it really had a big impact on them.
Yeah, their lived experience, I think, gives us really valuable insight here. They talk about how their scripting and their echolalia were seen as problems.
Wow.
Like it was just noise.
Yeah.
And so the interventions were all about suppressing those things. And this often led to language going backwards or selective mutism or this deep distrust in communication.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just like one bad experience. This was a systemic issue because the whole framework was saying this way of communicating is wrong.
So if scripting is actually a form of communication for GLPs, what does it do for them?
Well, Dr. Hoerricks talks about a few key functions.
Yeah, okay.
So scripting can be a way to regulate emotions, to create a sense of predictability and order.
Okay.
In a world that can feel very overwhelming.
Right.
It can also be a way to connect with other people.
Interesting.
It's like saying, I'm here, I'm trying to talk to you.
Yeah.
And so when you try to fade these scripts, it sends a message that your way of being is wrong.
Right. And this brings us to the ethical side of things.
Yeah.
And this idea of able-grounded phenomenology.
Right, AGP.
How does that help us understand this issue of script fading?
So AGP is really about centering the autistic person's experience.
Okay.
It's about shifting away from just looking at behavior.
Yeah.
And asking, what does this action mean to the person doing it?
Right.
So when it comes to scripting, it's not about just trying to get rid of a behavior. It's about understanding why the person is doing it.
Right.
What does it mean to them?
Yeah.
So it raises these questions like, are we trying to stop communication?
Yeah.
Or are we actually trying to support it?
Wow.
Are we rewarding performance or are we building relationships?
That's huge.
It is a big shift.
So if we're not just trying to tweak ABA,
Right.
what does a truly GLP-affirming approach look like?
Yeah, so Dr. Hoerricks is clear that we need a real change in perspective.
Okay.
So instead of forcing GLP communication into ABA, we need to start with GLP-informed practices.
Right.
So this means seeing scripting as the foundation,
Okay.
not something to get rid of.
Yeah.
And echolalia, instead of being a deficit, it's actually a thread that the person uses to develop their language.
Okay.
So the focus shifts from overriding the child's communication to listening to it and meeting them where they are.
It's about understanding their language.
Exactly.
And it seems like more and more people are starting to recognize this.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Hoerricks talks about, speech-language pathologists who understand Gestalt language processing and autistic-led frameworks like AGP.
Right.
These approaches are all about respecting the person's inner world, their way of knowing, and finding interventions that are respectful and supportive.
Not coercive.
Right. It's about getting rid of those old, harmful ways of thinking.
Yeah.
And replacing them with something that's grounded in real experience.
Okay.
And, a commitment to dignity and rights.
And Dr. Hoerricks makes this really powerful statement.
Yeah.
They say ABA needs to fade its own scripts.
Right.
What do they mean by that?
So I think they're saying that ABA practitioners need to step back and really look at their assumptions.
Okay.
Those deep-seated beliefs that scripting is always bad.
Right.
That behavior has no meaning.
Yeah.
And that data is more important than understanding a person's experience. It's about questioning the whole idea that language has to be neurotypical to be valid.
And it seems like the voices of autistic adults who've been through these therapies are really important in this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. There's this growing movement of autistic adults who identify as ABA survivors.
Wow.
And they're not just trying to reform ABA.
Yeah.
They're trying to challenge the whole system.
Okay.
They're asking, is this really effective in the long run?
Right.
Does it really help people develop their own authentic communication?
Yeah.
And they're bravely sharing their stories of harm.
Right.
And this is having a real impact on how people are thinking about these issues.
So to sum up, the main argument we've been looking at is that script fading, even though it's supposed to help with communication, can actually do the opposite for Gestalt language processors.
Right.
Because it doesn't see their scripting as real communication.
Exactly. And by looking at it the wrong way, we risk silencing the very people we're trying to help.
So the real fading that needs to happen isn't about the scripts. It's about the systems and frameworks that don't get it.
Absolutely.
So, the question for all of us is, are we really listening to understand all the different ways people communicate?
Yeah.
Or are we only hearing what we expect to hear?
That's a great question to leave people with.
It is a powerful thought.
It is. And anyone who wants to explore this further, there's so many resources out there on Gestalt language processing and neurodiversity affirming practices.
Right.
And I think it's so important that we learn to honor all forms of communication and recognize that everyone's voice matters.
Absolutely.
It really does.
Yeah.